So at WPS, we believe in unlocking potential, not just for your clients, but for practitioners too, which we've been doing for over 75 years now. So when we develop a test, we bring an author's idea to life, answer a researcher's question, meet a clinician's need, and ideally change an individual's life for the better. This free webinar is hosted by the WPS Professional Learning Center ProLearn. So please scan these QR codes. These will be in the PowerPoint that you get as well for more information on upcoming professional development opportunities that are hosted by ProLearn, including webinars, ADOS2, and tests of dyslexia training. On that note of dyslexia, I encourage you to reserve your spot for the upcoming Educating Students with Dyslexia, What Does the Law Say and What Are the Issues webinar. I'm very much looking forward to that one. That's going to be hosted by Julie Weatherly, who's an attorney. That's being held on August the 27th from 9 a.m. to 10:30 Pacific. You'll see a link in the chat for registration for that. So register now so you don't forget, because that's a good one coming up. We'll start with introductions. I'm Stephanie Kneedler. I'm a nationally certified school psychologist. I have a decade of experience serving students of all ages. I also serve in leadership positions for both the Washington State Association of School Psychologists and the National Association of School Psychologists. You'll see a little disclaimer there. I am an assessment consultant, as is Dawn with WPS, and we are salaried employees. We have no relevant financial interest or conflict of interest related to today's presentation. You'll see on this slide also my contact information. So I serve our customers in Alaska, Hawaii, the Pacific Northwest, Mountain West, and a portion of the Midwest. At the end of today's PowerPoint, you'll see all of the contact information for the various assessment consultants that are serving nationwide.
Hi, and I'm Dawn Muller. I'm an assessment consultant in the Northeast region of the U.S., starting in Maine and going all the way down to Virginia, but I'm currently in Maryland. I'm located in Maryland. I'm also a nationally certified school psychologist. I have a background in communication disorders as well as psychology, and I practiced as a school psychologist for about 24 years in public schools and also at a school for the deaf.
All right, thank you, Dawn. So this webinar is approximately 90 minutes. And in that time, it's our goal to achieve these learning objectives. So participants are going to describe the key components of integrative language theory and how to complete a comprehensive oral language assessment using a battery of different tests that are built on this theory. You'll describe the function, theory, and key administration features of a variety of speech and language assessments that are used to evaluate oral language. And then we're going to spend some time talking about how to support teams and offer data-based, individualized recommendations and interventions. We'll be talking about the assessment of oral language in the context of the work of Dr. Elizabeth Carroll Woolfolk and her integrative language theory. So the theoretical foundation of her work and our discussion today is that we have an infinite number of subjects to communicate on, and that language is the shortcut, it's the code by which we can efficiently refer to our world and represent things and ideas. So effective assessment is a key component of unlocking the potential of clients or students who are experiencing difficulty or delays in cracking that code. Just some foundational information to set the stage for our discussion. Oral language is the system through which we express knowledge, ideas, and feelings. It encompasses our ability to comprehend what we receive, as well as the ability to express effectively. Key components of oral language include its form, content, and use. Taken together, this includes the sound systems of language, how sounds are organized and used to convey meaning, the structure of words into units of meaning, the rules of constructing sentences, and the arrangement of words and phrases for meaning. This, in addition to how we understand and interpret the meaning of words, phrases, and sentences in context, including within the social world and conversational norms. In addition to all that, oral language skills are foundational for literacy, and they form the basis for learning to read and write. Generally speaking, we have the innate capacity for language learning. So while it's true that environment plays a really significant role in language acquisition, we do, again, typically speaking, come equipped with this mechanism for acquiring language. If we think of language as a code, there are several complexities to it. And in looking at the use of spoken English, again, typically speaking, we see children work through these complexities by applying different yet somehow predictable rules throughout this period of acquisition that proficient speakers don't use. And you'll see the example there, I goed there versus I goed there before versus I went there before. And those applications seem to remediate with practice. So at its heart, the development of oral language can be understood as this interplay between some innate human ability for the acquisition of language, the environment in which a person is learning and using language, and its real-life application. In terms of milestones, this early developmental period, being birth to 3 years, is the most intensive for oral language development. Before children have really learned their native language, many are displaying the capacity for and demonstrate the initial use of spoken communication. So a couple examples: newborns trying to communicate when they're hungry or responding to the voice of a caregiver. Even just within 6 months, most babies are recognizing the basic sounds of their native language. So some variability, there is a typical trajectory for the mastery of oral language in early childhood. These next few slides, they really just seek to highlight the enormity of oral language acquisition that's occurring in the birth to 3, well, we're taking it through all the way birth to 5 period. This, of course, is not an exhaustive list, but it's just some highlights of the typical trajectory. So from birth to 3 months, showing reaction to loud sounds, smiling to a caregiver. This is really quickly followed up with being able to follow sound with their eyes, babbling, listening, imitating speech sounds. And then finally, just by the first year of life, producing those first 1 or 2 words. Within that first year, children start to follow simple commands, put words together. Between ages 2 and 3, children show a rapidly expanding vocabulary and speak in a way that is understood by family and friends. By 3 to 4 years old, children typically can hear when people are calling to them from another room and speak with ease without having to repeat syllables or words. By the age of 4 or 5 years, children can typically pay attention to a short story and answer simple questions about it, communicate easily with other children and adults, use rhyming words, and demonstrate the ability to use the grammar of a proficient speaker. So throughout, I've talked about the typical acquisition of oral language in humans, but there, of course, can be divergence in the acquisition of language and delays in understanding what others say or in the ability to express thoughts and ideas might be indicative of a language disorder, perhaps a developmental language disorder, which would signify some delays in the achievement of milestones such that a person is really significantly behind their peers, or perhaps an apraxia of speech, which would make it difficult to order sounds or syllables correctly to form words such that a person could be understood. There are other diagnoses, of course, that can impact acquisition of oral language, like autism spectrum disorder or intellectual disability. It's also true that delays in oral language acquisition can be due to hearing loss rather than some inherent language disorder. Oral language, it has an enormous impact on social skills, demonstration of cognitive ability, and literacy. So language disorder, talked a little bit about etiology, but regardless of etiology, is a high incidence condition. Some data here to demonstrate that 7.7% of parents reported that their kids ages 3 to 17 had demonstrated some difficulty with language in the past year. Language disorders can impact quality of life in areas like social connectedness, school achievement, employment. A person's mental health can be impacted by disruption in the ability to receive and express ideas effectively, as well as the implications of the impact it has on other areas. So knowing this, intervention is crucial. And intervention at any time is going to be important, but like most things, the earlier the intervention can be provided, the most fruitful the outcomes. Last bullet point here, interestingly enough, in a review of language interventions, the research tells us that children who undergo comprehensive language assessment, that is, language assessment that moves beyond initial screenings, reported higher effects of the interventions that they received. And this may be because more comprehensive assessment lends itself to more individualized interventions. The importance of comprehensive language assessment and the impact that it can have on intervention brings us to the work of Dr. Elizabeth Carroll Woolfolk and integrative language theory. Integrative language theory, or ILT, reflects language across two dimensions. It refers to language knowledge, or the structure of language, as well as language performance, or the processing of language. There's a family of assessments that we're going to talk about today that are based on ILT. The Comprehensive Assessment of Spoken Language, Second Edition, CASL-2, the Oral and Written Language Scales, Second Edition, OWLS-2, and the Oral Passage Understanding Scale, OPUS, are all based on integrative language theory. So taken together, these provide a framework for describing and assessing, elements of language. One of the dimensions of ILT, language knowledge, represents the form and content of language known as the structure of language. And within that, there are four distinct categories: lexical semantic, syntactic, supralinguistic, and pragmatic. So lexical semantic skills represent the words and word combinations that make up our vocabulary. So these are content words, words that refer to an object, its quality, its action, or the nouns, verbs, adjectives, and adverbs of language. Syntactic skills encompass the grammatical rules of language, meaning, and the structural use of language. Supralinguistic skills then are the ability to analyze language beyond its literal meaning, so it's non-literal language. In this category, we've got to apply background knowledge and context to be able to understand what we're receiving. So think figurative language, words with double meanings, sarcasm, and inference. Last, pragmatic language refers to the contextual aspects of language that influence how language is expressed or interpreted. So this is language that's appropriate to a situation, a person, or a particular interaction. The other dimension of ILT is language performance. Language performance is interested in the processing of language. And this includes our comprehension and expression of spoken language, as well as our processing and understanding of written language. The auditory comprehension piece involves internal factors and external factors to understand the intended meaning of the speaker or words in print. This includes integration of sensation, perception, memory, world knowledge, and experience. In terms of the oral expression component, we've then got to formulate and verbalize our message, including selecting the right words in context. Thinking about the language knowledge component of ILT, you'll see that there are several assessments that are designed to assess those four areas, and you'll see those mapped onto the various constructs here. We're spending our time today talking about the OWLS-2, CASL-2, and OPUS, but there is also the CAPS listed here under pragmatic language. So the CAPS is the clinical assessment of pragmatics, which is a video-based assessment designed to create a more naturalistic opportunity to assess both the appraisal and use of pragmatic language in people ages 7 to 18. There is also, of course, the Arizona 4 for the assessment of articulation. And I encourage you to please ask questions in the Q&A or connect with your regional assessment consultant to learn more about CAPS and or Arizona 4. Moving into our exploration of the family of assessments designed to help you conduct a comprehensive assessment of oral language, the OWLS-2, CASL-2, and OPUS, again, all authored by Dr. Elizabeth Carroll Woolfolk. So all three assessments are based on integrative language theory, and they're used together to complete a comprehensive oral language assessment. And we're going to unpack all of this in more detail, but know that the use of all three tests allows you to analyze specific strengths and needs relevant to a person's use of oral language with the purpose of developing individualized interventions. In being interconnected, it means that these tests inform each other, and they're used to create an integrated and comprehensive view of a person's use of oral language. So in this model, you would give the OWLS-2 first. Results of the OWLS-2 actually informs which areas you might want to follow up on using the CASL-2. So the OWLS-2 is looking at language processing, which is one aspect of ILT, in the context of language knowledge, which is the other aspect of ILT. So that is, OWLS-2 is looking at auditory comprehension and oral expression across the 4 categories of identified language knowledge. So using the resources that WPS has provided to help you conduct an item analysis, you can then determine which precise areas of language knowledge you wish to focus on using the CASL-2. The CASL-2 is the shining star of language knowledge, right? Because it's measuring very specific skills within those 4 areas of language knowledge. The third test in this family is the OPUS. So the OPUS Oral Passage Understanding Scale, it's an integrated task of listening comprehension, which again is a measure of language knowledge. So the OPUS is a companion to the CASL-2. The CASL-2 measures really specific lexical, semantic, syntactic, and superlinguistic skills separately. And then the OPUS integrates those skills into a singular listening comprehension task. So these 2 tests, CASL-2 and OPUS are co-normed. So pairing CASL-2 with OPUS presents a more complete picture of listening comprehension ability. So we're going to be referencing a case example throughout today's webinar to illustrate how these assessments are used together to make for a comprehensive profile, which can be used for individualized interventions, because that's the whole point. So these next few slides provide some background information on David. David is 7 years and 11 months. He's been referred to us for evaluation, as presently he's using minimal language. He's showing difficulty following multi-step directions, as well as expressing himself using spoken and written language. And then in addition, he's described as playing alone on the playground. We've got information from David's teacher on his overall use of language. So she's describing David as appearing lost during instruction, showing errors in his assignments, having a hard time following spoken directions. He's not a kid who's asking for clarification or repetition when he doesn't understand something. David's decoding skills are at grade level, but he's showing some difficulty when he's writing, specifically selecting topics, organizing his thoughts, and revising his work. So really being expressive in his writing. He writes in simple sentences. Having said that, he's an average speller, and he's using capitalization and punctuation correctly. From the family perspective, David's using minimal expressive language at home. So it's seeming to his caregivers that he's having a difficult time keeping up with conversations. He's described as shy, and it seems like he may be avoiding communication with his peers and his family. Lucky for us, we also have some developmental information to consider. So a lot of David's developmental milestones are intact, right? So motor milestones are met in the typical sequence. We've ruled out hearing as being a contributing factor. In regards to communication, though, he could imitate, he was interactive, but he showed minimal babbling, and he was slower to progress with vocabulary. So what's starting to form is a good case for doing a dive into David's receptive and expressive language. His early educational history tells us more of the story too. So in preschool, he's described as shy, but he's showing typical play skills. No major concerns reported by preschool teacher. In kindergarten, it seems like he was making progress in the curriculum, but it was starting to show that he wasn't an eager participant, and he gave answers that were more restricted in scope than his peers. First grade report, that's where we are now, is that decoding is going well, but perhaps there's some attention needed to his comprehension. So right now, David is in an intervention group to address concerns with his reading comprehension. And there's also some existing evaluation data for us to review. So on a broad scale, academically, reading and math are typical as compared to others his age. From you sharing your lines of work, I know not everybody is working with standardized testing necessarily, but scores like 101, 107 would tell us, oh, he's generally working within the range of same age peers. His broad written language scores, however, showed some real significant difficulty on those writing tasks. Looking to his IQ results, he's got typical visual spatial, fluid reasoning, and processing speed skills. Now, working memory in this profile is something to consider, given that it's on that lower end of average, especially knowing that there can be an auditory comprehension component to working memory as measured by the WISC. So we'd want to look deeper into his performance on that task because there might be some attention that's needed to his listening abilities. Then looking to verbal comprehension here on his IQ testing, we know that in this particular test, that's looking pretty heavily at verbal knowledge and reasoning. And this is where we see a significant difference as compared to those other abilities. And that score of 81, is pretty consistent with that broad written language score of 79. So now we know we've got more digging to do. So the takeaways from this are we've got to learn more about David's verbal comprehension and his written expression. And there's a tool that's designed to do that. And that was our seamless segue into the first of our family of assessments, the Oral Written Language Scale Second Edition, or the OWLS-2. So the OWLS-2 is a standardized measure of language performance. It measures oral expression, listening comprehension, written expression, and reading comprehension. You'll see that the oral language battery is for people ages 3 to 21 years of age, and the written language battery is for those 5 to 21 years of age. Each of those 4 scales is individually administered. They take about 10 to 30 minutes to give. So the OWLS-2 is a fairly quick test, efficient test. The OWLS-2 was published in 2011. So this assessment is undergoing revision, and there's going to be information on becoming a data collector for the OWLS-3 at the end of this webinar. Everyone interested in, of course, is encouraged to participate, with emphasis on those of you who work with groups who are typically underserved or underrepresented in standardized testing. The 4 scales of the OWLS-2 can be given separately, though when all 4 are given, it provides a complete score profile that identifies strengths and need across those 4 linguistic structures. As far as kits are concerned, there is a kit that looks only at listening comprehension and oral expression. That's the oral language kit. There's a kit that's looking just at reading comprehension and written expression. That's the written language kit. Or there is a kit that includes both and all 4 scales. Relating the OWLS-2 back to integrative language theory, because that's its basis, this assessment addresses all areas of language processing. So it's looking at comprehending spoken language, expressing spoken language, comprehending written language, and expressing written language. Some quick notes on administration, scoring, and interpretation. The OWLS-2 comes as a print test. It also has digital easels that are available on the WPS Online Evaluation System, or OES. It has 3 manuals. It comes with record forms and response booklets, including parallel forms B. It, of course, has test easels and the comprehensive profile form. The OWLS-2 is an individually administered assessment. So Form A is used for your initial administrations. There is a Form B for repeat administrations. You can administer 1, 2, 3, or all 4 scales. Scales can be administered in any order. One insider tip on this is that listening comprehension doesn't require any kind of verbal response, which can make it an ideal introductory task. But you can make this battery your own, being able to give one or all the scales or some combination of scales. This table lists out each of the OWLS-2 scales, the process that it measures, and the format in which it's delivered. So you'll see that the OWLS-2 is a combination of items that are delivered verbally and visually. Responses are obtained verbally by pointing or in writing, depending upon the task. The OWLS-2 was designed to identify strengths and needs in language and can be used to identify the presence of language delays and disabilities. Again, it's intended for all 4 scales to be used, but know that each scale can be given independently. So these 4 scales can be combined to yield 5 different composite scores for you. So listening comprehension and oral expression together make the oral language composite. Reading comprehension and written expression together yield a written language composite. Listening comprehension and oral expression, listening comprehension and reading comprehension combine for a receptive language composite, and oral expression and written expression give an expressive language composite. If you give all 4, then you can generate an overall language composite score as well. I mentioned before that it is a language processing test, but the 4 areas of language knowledge are represented within those processing tasks. So you'll see that within the OWLS-2, it is measuring vocabulary, grammatical morphemes, non-literal language, and functional and social characteristics of language. There's also inclusion if you give the reading and writing tasks of text structure, which asks for integration of all these categories for the purpose of appraising and producing written language. There's also an analysis of conventions in writing. In interpreting the OWLS-2, you're encouraged to interpret this one like a funnel. So looking to the overall language score first, then looking at composite score at the composite score level before looking at the individual scales. Now, this is where we get into sweet stuff with intervention and then planning the next part of our assessment. So to both link your OWLS-2 to intervention and plan the next step in your data gathering, you're going to complete the item analysis worksheet. So this is located within your record form. I'll show you an example on the next slide. On the listening comprehension and oral expression scales of the OWLS-2, there are 4 columns for each of the language knowledge areas, as well as the specific skills that were tested. So the process for item analysis here is super simple. You're going to write a plus for correct answers and a minus for incorrect answers, NR for no response, and then you're going to have a visual representation of strengths and needs. Beyond that, now you're going to be able to appraise which areas of language knowledge and which skills within those 4 areas of language knowledge might require further exploration using the CASL-2, because remember, CASL is going to do a deeper, more specific dive into those areas. So this is a teeny tiny example of that item analysis sheet, but you will see going across the top those areas of language knowledge. And that's going to serve as your visual guide for where you want to focus your attention using the CASL-2. This too is tiny, but information is contained within your manual, and it's the guidelines for interpreting the OWLS-2. It gives you information on what common error patterns mean so that you can consider the best interventions. You're also going to see that the companion book to the OWLS-2 Foundations of Language Assessment has an in-depth discussion of interpretation. So the purpose here, as you're reading through this, is to consider the pattern of errors across those 4 areas of language knowledge, and common error patterns are then grouped across all of these areas. So you'll see here, errors of lexical semantic items are linguistic. Maybe they're using the incorrect bound morphemes. They're phonological, so substituting one sound for another in a word, but not because of an articulation problem. Or they are conceptual, showing a lack of understanding of the item's meaning or task. You've got errors of syntactic items being omissions or additions, substitutions, sentence structure. So sentence structure might be due to problems in many different areas of the sentence itself. And so you've got to examine their performance on those specific sentences in order to get the most information out of that. Errors of superlinguistic items, perhaps they are selecting literal meanings rather than non-literal ones, and it may indicate to you a lack of language maturity. And then you're looking at common errors of pragmatic items. So requesting information, responding to requests, presenting a position, greeting somebody, expressing appropriate feelings, relating an event, and finding a solution to a problem. Beyond those 4 areas of language knowledge, there's also common errors of text structure. Those often co-occur with errors in these other areas. So you'll want to consider those in the context of the 4 areas of language knowledge. And then you can do an analysis of the error of conventions. So what's helpful about this, as you see, is that rather than making general statements that, oh, there seems to be an issue with pragmatic language, well, now we have more specific information about which areas we want to consider for targeted interventions. Part 2 of this link to intervention process is to complete the comprehensive profile form, which is available for download from the WPS website. So you can go, I'll share with you resources in a couple slides down, but that's located at WPSpublished.com on the OWLS-2 page. Completion of this form allows you to calculate composites and make comparisons among all the scales. A brief but important note on the OWLS-2 is that the standardization samples included over 2,000 participants with a US Census match. This instrument did include a clinical validation sample for people with various speech and language disorders, as well as those receiving intervention for psychological or behavioral needs. So these are those resources I was mentioning. Resources available on the OWLS-2 include several documents that you can download at WPSpublished.com, including the quick reference guide, a sample test report, a case example, the comprehensive profile form, and then frequently asked questions. The online evaluation system, or OES, includes those digital manuals and digital easels that are available for purchase. So returning to David, we've given our OWLS-2. We want to see how those scores shook out and whether there's agreement among the data that's been collected so far. So now we've got more information as it relates to his language processing, and we see some really significant difficulties in his expression, particularly oral expression, written expression. So that's demonstrated across spoken and written language. His listening comprehension abilities too are likely really having an influence on his conversation, on his social connectedness, and on his achievement. And so our data so far is telling the same story as what his caregivers and his teachers are noticing in the classroom, is that he may be having a hard time following along with what's going on. That's impacting his expression, but then he may also have some difficulty with just verbal knowledge and verbal reasoning to be able to produce robust responses, either speaking or in writing. So knowing what the OWLS-2 has told us, it's time to drill down even further and get an idea of where the breakdown is occurring for David so that we can focus our efforts specifically on the components of language that he's needing the most support in. And this is where I'm going to turn it over to Dawn and the CASL-2.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. Now it's my turn to take you on a little journey with the Comprehensive Assessment of Spoken Language, 2nd edition. This test was also authored by Dr. Carol Woolfolk. So the CASL-2, it's reliable, it's valid, and a comprehensive norm-based measure of language skills for individuals ages 3 to 21. The design of the CASL allows for examining specific elements of language individually in order to identify areas of strength and need. And the benefit is that it measures oral language processing skills across 4 categories. So we'll see both processing and the language structures involved from the integrative language theory and its construct. There are 14 standalone performance-based tests. They're considered tests, not subtests, because each has a mean of 100 and standard deviation of 15. And this offers some flexibility of giving only one specific test of interest or selecting those to calculate specific index scores that you need. You have the option to obtain 6 different index scores, and this flexibility allows the clinician to really design their ideal battery for optimal results when addressing the needs of each student on a case-by-case basis. It doesn't take too long. The standard administration for each test is about 5 to 10 minutes. To gain a comprehensive score index score called the General Language Ability Index Score, it would take you anywhere from 45 to 60 minutes, just depending on the individual's performance. The scores that you can obtain are standard scores, confidence intervals, percentile ranks, and descriptive ranges. It was published by WPS in 2017, and it's obviously the second edition of the original CASL that was from 1999. So the CASL-2 measures both receptive and expressive skills of language performance across those 4 specific areas of spoken language. And while many tests focus solely on lexical, semantic, or syntactic knowledge, the CASL-2 also examines those higher level linguistic skills, like superlinguistic skills, and also pragmatic language. And each test will target a specific area of language knowledge and one area of performance. So results are precise with very little interference from other processing or knowledge areas. On pages 2 and 3 of your manual, it'll give you a nice overview of the CASL-2 tests. But in short, we're looking at lexical semantic skills, which include receptive vocabulary, antonyms, synonyms, expressive vocabulary, idiomatic language, those syntactic skills, which include sentence expression, grammatical morphemes, sentence comprehension, and grammaticality judgment. And then superlinguistic skills, which are non-literal language, meaning from context, inference, and double meaning. And then also we have pragmatic language, which consists of items that are presented with pictures in the beginning and then later without pictures, and are measuring the individual's ability to understand and apply pragmatic rules, just recognized by society to be appropriate for a given context. So the CASL-2 can further break down those language structures and language performance skills when we're evaluating our students. So as we saw with the OWLS-2, we're getting listening comprehension and oral expression skills and those areas of language performance. But now we're using the CASL, we can take a deeper dive into the language structures. And this is how those 2 tests work really nicely together, like Stephanie was saying. So back to ILT and the foundations, the CASL-2's theoretical foundation is based on ILT, as we saw with the OPUS. And just remember that ILT reflects the 2 dimensions, which provide that framework for describing and accessing the elements of spoken language. So we're looking at language knowledge and language performance. And again, real quickly, language knowledge includes structure, form, content, as defined by those categories of lexical semantics, syntactic, and superlinguistic. And then language performance is based on the processing systems, including auditory comprehension and oral expression, also known as receptive and expressive language indexes, scores within your CASL-2. So let's briefly review administration, scoring, and interpretation. Your manual will include all of your information for administering and scoring your test, your reliability and your validity information, all of your psychometrics, and all of your tables for scoring. And then your record forms will arrive to you in packs of 10. There's a comprehensive record form, and that contains all 14 tests, and that can be used across the ages of 3 to 21. If you just work with preschoolers, though, there's a preschool form that contains 10 tests that are for that particular age range of preschool, and it maxes out at the age of 6. So you have that option to purchase also digital easels if, for example, you work remotely. And we do offer free online scoring on our online evaluation system. You just enter in your raw data from your protocol, and our system will then generate beautiful score reports for you and some narrative explanations of the tests on the CASL too. So back to, all right, the back of your record form will actually contain a spot for your demographic information. So it's on the back on this one, and your scores. So if you open it up, you'll see areas for plotting your scores and plotting the graphs. And it has a really nice section for comparisons and looking at base rates as well. Some things to remember: if you administer 2 or more tests, you just follow the order in which they're presented in your test easels. And the basal and ceiling rules are super easy for the CASL-2. It's 4 correct to establish a basal and 4 incorrect to reach your ceiling. And just remember, always count those items before your basal. And the following tests here receive a score of 0, 1, or 2, the ones that are listed here. So like I mentioned, the CASL-2 is comprised of 14 tests, each yield a standard score, and then you can obtain up to 6 index scores for those tests. So your overall score is your general language ability, the GLAI, and then you're able to calculate a receptive language index, which is your overall auditory comprehension skills that measure listening comprehension and yield that index. And then you'll be able to obtain an expressive language index as well, just looking at those skills in oral expression and the tests that really require expressive responses within that test. And then the lexical semantics index, which looks at overall word knowledge. And then you'll also obtain a syntactic index that's looking at the overall ability to understand and use grammatical structures. And then also the supralinguistic index, and that's accessing your ability to understand at a deeper meaning of vocabulary and syntax, and in order to use language in a more flexible manner, such as inferencing and using double meanings. That qualitative item analysis allows for the identification of real specific areas and parts of oral language that are really helpful for our interventions. So there are really nice charts within the manual that explicitly explain the test, also categories or indexes that the test loads into, the language processes and whether it be receptive or expressive, and how many items are also presented and how they're presented in terms of the skills that the test is measuring. Also, you're going to see what poor performance on a specific test may mean within the CASL. So this is a really helpful chart when interpreting your information and writing your reports. And you can find this chart right in the manual on pages 31 and 32. It's chart 3.2. And this is just, this next slide is just a continuation of that interpretive chart on page 32. So how are we then going to link our findings to intervention? And as I mentioned, each test you've given loads into a language structure: lexical, semantic, syntactic, supralinguistic, and a language process: receptive or expressive language skills. Definitely don't forget to read your manual. I promise it really isn't that bad, and the majority of it consists of charts in the beginning that are used, in the end, that are used for scoring. But the beginning really has all those narrative portions that are super critical for you to read. As this today is just an overview of the CASL-2 and these other assessments that we're talking about. So I promise you'll find it very helpful, and it will greatly assist you when doing all the interpretation of your data. Just like with the OWLS-2, the CASL-2 has great and useful item analysis worksheets within your protocol, and that provides really valuable insight in terms of an individual's area of strengths and their difficulties. There's a worksheet for each structure or each process, and it allows the clinician to really identify any patterns that at a more finely kind of grained level, such as like prepositions or verbs or nouns, complex sentences, even sarcasm, indirect requests, etc. So additionally, the CASL-2 allows for both preferred and acceptable responses, and the item analysis worksheet allows you to really examine the precision at which of the examinee's responses on the test. So additionally, there's a nice table 3.3 in your manual, and that indicates the ages at which 90% of individuals in the standardization sample correctly responded to each item. It is really in depth, and it's a great and useful chart. So this tells you whether an item failure may be due to the child's age. And then lastly, the CASL is super useful for tracking improvement and progress monitoring as well. This is another great chart that's on the last page of your protocol on your record form. This is kind of at a glance for you to look at what subtests are appropriate for which ages. Here we lay out the standardization sample. It was standardized on over 2,000 typically developing participants who were representative of the US Census in terms of gender, ethnicity, geographic region, and parents' educational level. The clinical samples that were included with children with diagnoses are listed there on that slide, and information about each of those groups is within those clinical samples is also available in your manual. So some final thoughts for the CASL. It's often a struggle that we know to determine whether what is going on with your client is a language delay versus a language difference. But the CASL really does a nice job to attack this in a few different ways. So it provides alternate scoring for dialectical differences so that we're not really penalizing those differences. And it can allow for multiple correct item responses as well to account for different yet acceptable ways that individuals may use spoken language. And it really attempts to focus on measuring one skill at a time in order to eliminate language difference factors and to isolate any possible language delay. There are some considerations regarding our English language learner students, so just keep this in mind. Just note that the CASL-2 was standardized on individuals who demonstrated proficiency in English as judged by the clinician. This wouldn't necessarily be an appropriate tool to use if a student doesn't exhibit sufficient English proficiency, but the items and the responses do have some qualitative value for you to plan and for clinical purposes. So just be careful not to necessarily rely too heavily on those standard scores. A really, really super unique feature of the CASL-2 when compared to all of our other assessments that are out there for oral language is the alternative responses for dialectical differences. And this is for African American dialect. Although the CASL-2 was developed really to assess mainstream spoken English, the author really recognized the role that dialects in spoken English play and the issues that this can often present for clinicians when scoring your language tests. So this is critical information when determining whether it is a language disorder versus a language difference. So you'll find asterisks in your protocol that note each of these items that account for dialectical differences. And chapter 3 of your manual goes into a deeper dive and discusses this in more length. Okay, all right, Stephanie, now we're going to get back to taking a look at David. So we went ahead and we administered the CASL-2, and David's overall general language ability score was a 77, falling in the below average range. So issues were really prevalent in the areas of lexical semantic skills, but more specifically at the test level, he struggled with expressive vocabulary skills much more than receptive vocabulary skills that fell in the average range. So he struggled with antonyms as well, and syntactically, David also had some issues, but specifically related to sentence expression, grammatical morphemes, and grammaticality judgment that fell in the below average range. Superlinguistic skills indicated that specifically non-literal language, inferencing and double meanings were weak for him. So we have a lot more information now to be able to decide on some interventions and some approaches. All right, now I'm going to introduce you to a little companion of the CASL-2, just in case you want a bit more information on how these struggles within the language structures can translate and impact David in his everyday use of language. Okay, we're going to talk about the oral passage understanding scale, otherwise known as the OPUS, that Stephanie mentioned earlier. And this was also by Dr. Elizabeth Carroll Woolfolk and our own WPS's Dr. Amber Klein. This assessment was released in 2017. It's available in print and also on our OES, and it has free online scoring as well. And the CASL and OPUS are really linked. So Feedback from the original CASL users suggested that one of the original CASL tests, the passage comprehension test, didn't quite function as it was intended to. So users reported some frustration with some of the repetition of paragraphs, as well as some examinee fatigue. And so at that point, then the paragraph comprehension was removed within the second version. And a means of assessing listening paragraphs. Everyone still wanted that information, so the authors created a separate measure of integrated listening comprehension, and that's where we have the OPUS. So the OPUS provides a detailed assessment of an individual's listening comprehension of text passages, which is a skill essential, as we know, for classroom learning. And while the CASL-2 is useful for identifying those differential skill levels of specific lexical, semantic, syntactic, and superlinguistic tasks, the OPUS provides us with a measure of integrated oral language skills across the areas. So the OPUS is for individuals ages 5 to 21. The administration time is about 10 to 20 minutes per item set, and your results, you'll get results in a variety of scores, including age and grade-based standard scores, confidence intervals, percentile ranks, and age and grade equivalents, as well as descriptive ranges. The OPUS is a test of integrative listening that is also based on ILT. So administering the OPUS in addition to the CASL-2 provides more of that complete picture of the individual's listening comprehension ability. But the OPUS may also be used on its own, and when you have a referral question that doesn't necessarily require the specificity of all of the CASL-2 tests. So it assesses listening comprehension by measuring the ability to listen orally to presented passages and recall information about them. And therefore, it's really measuring, it's also tapping into those memory skills, which are integral, as we know, to listening comprehension. And you're able to gain information regarding comprehension of vocabulary, grammatical morphemes and inflections, inferencing, figurative language, those memory skills, and overall integration of language and memory. It requires the examinee to really integrate in those three linguistic categories of lexical, semantic, syntactic, and superlinguistic skills in order to listen and then respond appropriately. Okay, so jumping into administration, scoring, and interpretation. The OPUS includes a record form with really detailed item analysis worksheets that support writing your IEPs or your goals for intervention plans. And there's only one test easel with the OPUS, and that contains all of your information needed for your administration. You also get a manual within the kit, and there are audio files for each of the 17 passages. And so these audio files are available through our WPS website, and these are really specifically used for training purposes only to demonstrate the standard pace and the intonation for reading the OPUS passages. The manual, again, is a super easy read. It's not bulky. You'll need your record form for scoring, just like with the CASL-2. And just like with the CASL-2, you can enter in those scores from your raw data to go ahead and use our free online scoring through the OES. So the OPUS is individually administered, again, and the examiner will go ahead and select an item set based on the examinee's age and presumed ability. So each set contains 5 passages and then up to 44 items or questions. The examiner reads a passage aloud one at a time and then asks the related questions to the examinee. And the questions can be repeated, but not the passage itself. So the examinee then responds orally to the questions, and the passages reflect material that's really likely to be encountered in school or in real life situations. While only one item set is given to the examinee, you'll notice that some of the passages overlap there for ages. So you will be receiving one overall standard score on the OPUS, but in terms of your interpretation of the OPUS, you have the item analysis section of your at the passage level and both at the item level. So the passage analysis exploration of the individual's performance on each of the passages can provide really, really useful qualitative information. The passage type, the word count, the sentence count, the mean words per sentence, and the complexity index. And that can be really extremely useful. And then you can use table 3.2 in your manual. That will kind of display some characteristics that contribute to the difficulty of each passage, and then can be really useful when you're trying to discern why an examinee maybe had trouble with a particular passage. For example, was it fictional narrative or persuasive, nonfiction, etc. And then your record form also contains item analysis worksheets for each item set. So this worksheet provides a means of really reviewing the examinee's performance on each of the item types and the subtests measured by the OPUS. Really looking at those language structures and the processes that we've been discussing today. And then the types of skills that are measured during the item analysis relate really heavily back to ILT. And they would include lexical semantic, syntactic, and superlinguistic skills. And they also incorporate memory for recalling the passages and specific details, such as names of people or places and such within those passages. And additionally, we're able to analyze the ability to understand the passage's overall meaning by really integrating that language and memory piece. So this slide is just an example of chart 3.2. It's listing out the characteristics that may contribute to a child's difficulty within a passage, and that's located on page 20 of your manual. And for standardization, the OPUS was standardized on over 1,500 individuals, ages 5 to 21. And again, it was representative of the US Census. Your clinical sample information is also listed on that slide. So now we've gone ahead and we've administered the OPUS to David, which resulted in a significantly below average score of 72. So David's struggling within the classroom with understanding spoken paragraphs. And this is telling us that when he has to rely on those memory skills, he's struggling. And this may explain why we were hearing teacher reports like we were. His issue isn't at that vocabulary level. He's understanding what the words mean, but when having to pull it all together and recall the information and organize it, that's when he's struggling. So this is how the OPUS assisted us in gaining more of a perspective of how David's skills work in an everyday kind of classroom environment, with having to decipher so much content and so much information that's coming at him all day long. So overall, David's assessment results suggest that he has notable difficulties in several areas of language. So when first looking at the OWL scores, we saw listening comprehension. When David can understand basic spoken language, while he can understand basic spoken language, he struggles a little bit with more of the complexities and the abstract information. As in terms of oral expression, David had difficulty organizing his thoughts and using appropriate type of grammar and vocabulary when he was speaking. And then in terms of spoken language skills, David's scores on the CASL-2 indicated that challenges with vocabulary, lexical semantic skills, sentence structure with those syntactic skills, and making inferences, understanding figurative language, all those superlinguistic skills, and then also the pragmatic use of language. So as far as listening and higher order comprehension skills are concerned, the OPUS results showed us that significant difficulties in understanding and processing that spoken information, especially when having to make inferences and understanding the detailed content while having to rely on that memory, were an issue for him. So some recommendations for David's case may include some speech and language therapy. Regular sessions may be focusing on improving David's expressive language skills, including vocabulary development, sentence structure, and narrative skills. Also, definitely some classroom accommodations, just at a very basic level, providing written instructions for any verbal instructions, and also those visual aids are critical for David to support his comprehension skills. and then allowing David some extra time to really process and respond to that information. And then also social skills training may be really beneficial, and participating in maybe a group to improve his pragmatic language abilities and really helping him use language more effectively in his social interactions. So some key takeaways that we have. We hope you were able to leave this afternoon, that you're going to be able to leave this afternoon really understanding that the foundation for these 3 assessments is based on the integrative language theory. And it's important to really note that all these tests can be used separately, or they can be used in a combination with one another. They each serve their own purpose, but they should be useful to you in a very wide range of ages for your students as well. And each test is super helpful in terms of their item analysis, and they're all very simple to use and allow you to gather so much more information when you're trying to start with your interpretation of your results and then your report writing and ultimately your interventions. And speaking of report writing, the CASL-2 and the OPUS can be scored online for free. Just a reminder, all you have to do is enter in that raw data from your protocol, and this is super easy, and it's helpful to really reduce any of those calculation errors as well. All right, in the moments that we have left together, I wanted to be sure that we discussed some important aspects of intervention. So this, you'll see here, the Foundations of Language Assessment. This is a fantastic resource. It accompanies the OWLS 2, and it's included in the kit, but it's also a handbook that can be purchased separately. This last chapter of, the very last chapter within the book that really kind of highlights all of the interventions and how to build a successful intervention plan. So Dr. Carol Woolfolk explained the differences between learning skills through a hierarchy, so in steps, like first you learn this, and then we stop, and then we move on to the next thing, in more of that hierarchical fashion. And she refers to this as what's called the vertical model. And then she went on to explain a more effective model for types of interventions may be through a horizontal model. And with this, you would repeatedly layer the information to be learned, and you're constantly circling back through the process. And a really nice example that she made in the book was for herself learning how to play the game of bridge. And so she bought a book. She learned all the rules, and then she went and jumped in with a real game. And the events in the real game did not really occur in the same type of fashion that the book said that they would. So she was kind of in a little bit of a pickle, and she was in this real life session and having to generalize what she learned right on the fly. And there was what she noticed was there was an entire step that was missing with controlled practicing. So she went and she found that when this happened, learning didn't happen in a linear fashion. Even after playing the game, she had to then circle back to the rules and then would learn more about what she thought that she already knew. And as she continued to review the rules and practice in a more controlled setting with applying those rules, the information then really began to stick, and she was more prepared for those unexpected events that happened when she went out into a real game of bridge. So this was more of like a spiraling process than a vertical process. And this process can certainly, the note that she made was that this process can certainly be applied to our oral language interventions as well. And so she referred to them as learning the rules. So really the 3 steps: learning the rules, controlled practice, and playing the game. And with those 3 activities, learning the rules is considered more of like the meta learning. So this is where the student is really you're helping them to identify the language target, whether it be a name of something, a picture, a story. And then controlled practice allows for those applications of the skills. And an oral language intervention session can be composed of informal situations in which the student really is prompted for the use of those recently learned linguistic forms. And an important task of the clinician is to really make those controlled practice sessions memorable through the activities that you choose. And then lastly, the last process of intervention is what she refers to as playing the game. And so this is where the integration of the skills that the learner learned and the instructor or the clinician help them, but now the clinician will no longer be taking that active role so much. The learner is engaged in the speech or the reading activities without having all that immediate feedback anymore that they got during the controlled practice. However, they're always going to gain new information by, and it's really important to circle back and spiral back to review those rules continuously. So we have some exciting news as we near the end of the presentation. Based on the registration attendance today, we're going to be raffling off 5 copies of this book that's seen here. It's called The Neurogenetic Disorders of Language and Cognition, and it is a great resource guide. It's filled with so many strategies and interventions for various language disorders. We found it super helpful, and we have an example of a communication strategy chart that we found within the book. So good luck to everyone. And then when speaking about interventions, Stephanie and I felt that it was really important to present some recent and some updated research findings for you as well. So here, Kashke noted that pairing interventions with parent training improved the efficacy of the intervention. And I know many of you therapists out there experienced more parent involvement during the pandemic with remote therapies and such, so you can probably relate to this as well. The treatment recommendations in their article really varied based on the type of language delay, but included the following. For an expressive delay, the structured parental training. For receptive delay, language therapy. For phonetic delays, a traditional motor approach was helpful. And for lexical semantic, morphological and syntactic delays, more enrichment, modeling, elicitation, production opportunities, meta language, and visualizations were also effective. So what we know, what Dr. Carol Woolfolk recommended back in 2011 in the Foundations of Language Assessment, that book that I just showed you, regarding designing the interventions, in terms of some specific current research regarding intervention frequency, Frizzell found in 2020 that real frequent short intervention sessions coupled with less frequent longer sessions of at least once a week and 20 minutes yielded the best outcomes for developing vocabulary and morphosyntax. And they also noted that these interventions, and more importantly, structured instruction, are highly effective. And this ties nicely to what I just previously mentioned about that controlled practice and layering and spiraling the interventions. And this can be a super effective approach as well. Then lastly, this research from NIH in 2020 indicated that parent-child interactions have a strong relationship and influence on oral language development, and that it's important to target appropriate parent communication skills as well as an effective intervention. So additionally, this is no surprise, noted in the second part of the study, was that early intervention works and younger students responded to interventions faster than older students. All right, Stephanie, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Dawn. So thank you for attending today. There's a few more slides. We'll do some Q&A here at the end, but we at WPS have several opportunities right now for data collection, and you are compensated with cash or product credit. So don't hesitate to take advantage of some of these opportunities. But as you can see here, the OWLS 3 is on there. While it's a couple years in the making, we are collecting data for an English and a Spanish version. That's coming up. That's come up in the QA a few times. So you'll have the QR code in your handout, but you can scan the QR code here. And once again, everyone is encouraged to be a data collector, but emphasis on those of you that are working with underrepresented or underserved populations in standardized testing. This is the assessment consultant team covering all regions of the US, so you can reach out for product questions or consultations. We also offer complimentary trainings for customers for groups of 10 or more, so please feel free to reach out with questions or training requests. If you need help locating your specific consultant, you can email consult@wpspublish.com, where you can also drop any questions that weren't answered as a part of today. These are our business development managers at WPS, working collaboratively to meet your school and agency's needs. So we have some time for questions here at the end, and I'm going to pull up the Q&A to share some common questions that have come up over the course of our time together. Please feel free to continue to drop those in there. There were lots of questions about Spanish options that are available for these tests. So CASL-2, OWLS-2, OPUS are not available in a Spanish version, but like I said, OWLS-3 is collecting data for an English and a Spanish version. So that's exciting. Questions related to that around use of these tests with English learners. So these tests were standardized on people that were deemed to be English proficient. So in that case, you wouldn't want to apply standard scores to their performance, but you could, of course, use these tests to collect qualitative information about language acquisition for English learners. You could absolutely do that. Questions that have come up a couple times are, can these tests be used as singular assessments, or if you're pressed for time, which one would you choose? So which assessment, first off,
I'm just searching through, looking at
yes,
some.
and then also some questions around who can give tests like this. So all of these tests are used by a variety of professionals in a variety of settings. Yes, they're used by speech and language pathologists, there's used by psychologists, but in terms of who is using them at specific sites, that of course is up to the locality of that site. No questions about whether the CASL-2 is going to be revised. That one was published in 2017, so that's a newer one. No current plans for revision. And then questions about when to expect the OWLS-3, and that one is in its early stages of revision, so it will be some years, 2-4 years before that one comes out. Okay, so if there were questions that were not addressed today, or if you have questions that come up after today's webinar, then you can feel free again to drop those into consult@wpspublish.com.